So I guess something I want to talk about is this notion of the individual and maybe try to address, I guess these are some concerns about what what is meant by an individual and what is meant by the person and how did the person come to take itself to be the freestanding autonomous individual that I think we today come to understand that self to be. Now, part of the concern here is that when I hear so many people talk, particularly those who have some kind of strand of individualist orientation in their philosophy, I can't help but see them as imagining that we could just trust our eyes and the way that your eyes see a freestanding, isolated individual like a figure against a background. And they believe that to have a kind of reality that's a supreme truth, like I guess in the same way that a pen is an isolated object, just a figure against a background in an environment. I think that there are many people who just, by way of their imagination, imagine their own bodies that way, and then take that to be what it really is. That is, they've imagined their bodies in a kind of isolation from the world, and then now have subscribed to that kind of imagination as if that were what it really is. And I want to see if I can get at some of that. Now, from my own perspective, I have been, just raised and weaned in systems theory, and none of that makes sense. I mean, a person is part of a larger system, and those systems are embedded within other systems. I mean, not only is it the case that, from my perspective, the person is a okay. First you start off with, you're embedded within various kinds of physical closed systems. I mean, there's laws of entropy, and there are physical forces, gravity, all kinds of just, larger physical forces of the atmospheric pressure in which bodies emerge. And then as soon as you move to the living systems, and living systems are negentropic, right? They cut against physical systems entropy. And living systems have various forms of growth and development and order, and it's through metabolism and exchange and a kind of recognition of embeddedness within a transpiring and transaction. See, transaction is one of the key concepts in systems, where the elements within the system, they have semi-permeable boundaries or membranes, and they're giving and exchanging in such a way that they weren't they don't retain completely their own identity through the interaction. That's why it's called a transaction. Now, an element that kind of retains its own identity, like a physical, an atom or something like this, it has a kind of decay, I guess. But when we talk about something just moving its position but remaining unchanged in its movement, I mean, when I use just an object here in the world, we think of a kind of interaction with it. But when we try to get at entities which are affected in their own integrity as they interact, well, we want to get at it being a kind of transaction. So there are biological transactions. I mean, some of the simplest cases would be digestion. When you eat the food, the food that becomes available to you, you eat it and you digest it, you're metabolizing it. That's becoming you in some way. You don't just pass it all through. Now, you pass out what isn't usable any longer to your body, but nutrients have actually become one with your body. I mean, the way that air comes into your body and then circulates around your bloodstream, and the way certain molecules, an oxygen molecule, the way that it will float around through your body. Again, it's quite fascinating. Okay, so your body has your body is embedded in various biological systems, and one of the key aspects there, I brought it up in the David Bohm video, there is the the brain itself. I mean, I think we do want to say that human brains, the sort of new brain that emerged out on top of the various other brains. I mean, you have sort of lizard brain, then you have this sort of mammal brain with its limbic system, and then the new human brain with its developed cortex. That itself, language processing, again, is a large part of that. But that is part of a larger system. Now, I think the more that people try to understand the person is just located within the body, and then even worse, the body and then the brain is inside the body, and that's where the person is, I think people are going to completely miss it. Again, you're in a larger system. So not only does that brain itself develop in its nutritive commerce with the larger environment and has hereditary characteristics that it's taken on from what was previous to it. I mean, there's so many dimensions of what is transcended to a body, the sort of necessary but not yet sufficient conditions for a person. But by the time you have that brain is ready for various forms of social interaction that make for a kind of socio-historical system in the human. That is, the kind of brain that makes humans biologically unique is fitted for a socio-historical uniqueness in the biological sociality of the human. That is, the human is a social being, like many other organisms are characterized as social, but human sociality has a kind of collective learning or a time binding, what's called culture or language, understood very globally as a kind of, again, a cultural mimetics. There's lots of different phrases that people will use, but the time binding function of human makes humans socio-historical in ways that other creatures, they don't seem to be. Now, when people get all riled about this discussion, and I've been accused here by some people, Great Text here calls me a speciesist, I almost don't even understand it. Part of me is like, you've obviously not watched very little of my videos. I have tried to suggest I'm interested in those ways that differences of degree have become differences of kind. I completely agree that humans are continuous with the rest of nature. I don't want to privilege humans. I'm not suggesting they're at an elevated position. If anything, I'm saying humans are most subject to their own tampering. We are the most plastic of other of creatures. We are the most susceptible to fall into historical time-binding practices that are to our own detriment. It also means, yes, we could be able to invent things, but those inventions may be things like bombs that are going to be the end of us. I mean, the whole thing is, it's very much not intelligence that I'm arguing for. At any rate, when you start to move toward a human, you need to understand the human is embedded within lots of different systems. And again, there are physical systems, but I think we're more interested in the dimensions of living systems, the way in which our bodies are largely products of the nutritive and environmental, transactions, that your body has had. But it really becomes, I guess, now here's where it gets interesting, is that there are technological innovations that have released and made possible the kind of individual as we know the individual today. This freestanding individual who will form governments and legislate itself through representative governments. These are all products of communication technologies. I mean, to try to think for just a second that for hundreds of thousands of years, we'll say 100,000, 150,000 years, people lived in small hunter-gatherer societies that were largely egalitarian. I mean, there certainly were age differences and this sort of thing, but they weren't conditions of anonymous social structure. They were, again, something akin to family, extended family relations and tribal life. Not a Garden of Eden, not a bliss, but I think by some comparisons, that was the great age of humanity, and it reigned for, again, 100,000 years. Only after the last, in the last 15 or 10,000 years, with large agrarian societies and divine kings and hierarchies and all the kinds of problems that came from abstract money and social inequality and various forms of I guess, of alienation and estrangement. But it's literacy and the kind of individuation that literacy makes possible that we now experience, having given us the freestanding individual. See, reading is something that you do is very alone. You have to be alone to do it. You tell other people to be quiet, and you sit alone while you're reading, and it introduces a kind of inwardness and a reflective attention to one's own words in ways that are very, they release potentials of the individual taking seriously the extent to which it's isolated or separated off. Now, it changes for some people. What they were going to argue is that it changes the balance or ratio between the senses. It somehow releases the I from the hypnotic spell of tribal resonance, as the way Marshall McLuhan will say it, and that people become more and more, I guess, focused upon a detached, again, a kind of an awareness of the world as an object over there, open to scrutiny and inspection, and a kind of investigation. And the birth of the scientific orientation really comes in many ways with science, with literacy, right? I mean, beginner science, begins in many ways with forms of writing and phonetic literacy in particular. But I think what part of, I guess, the larger question then is that when I want to say I'm interested in that unique individual today, as we understand the individual today, I'm interested in the question of where and when is the individual. Again, it sounds like such an odd question, but I'm meaning it to sound odd to try to force the issue, right? Where and when is the individual? When we ask the question that way, it starts to become apparent that humans now, through communication technologies like YouTube, like right now, supposedly I'm talking to you. No, I'm talking to a recorder that is going to record something, and now as you're listening to this, you're listening to a record of the past, which for me was a lifetime utterance, but it's being broadcast throughout the world. And so right now people are, although sitting in a room, they're gaining access to my words. The human scope of where and when they are, what they take to be their concerns. This morning there were, I guess, some troubling videos, about the world, role of the UN, concerns over what's going on in Uganda. I mean, right now, the fact that we are animals who have been so able to transcend the immediate here and now of their environments to such an extent that we can not only have histories and have languages and have the capacity to talk about the world 100 years from now, as well as, our own ancient origin myths, but we can discuss with one another problems that are going on around the globe. That is pretty fascinating. And I think what we want to do is we want to see it as part of a whole web of interbedded systems, right? There's embedded and interrelated systems where you can't really isolate the individual down to, quotes, their body. And you can't even reduce it down to, the brain inside the body. Both of those are very highly problematic. Now, even if I'm going to say that, yes, there is some sort of cognitive representation, some cognitive neuronal firing patterns which make all that possible, what's the difference between me being in a room right here and me being on YouTube? Now, arguably, they're both just representations in my neuronal firing patterns. But one of them actually gets me out of my room. One of them, I'm actually really outside of the room. It is a genuine transcendence. See, I think there are people, and I've heard them on YouTube, make it seem as if humans don't genuinely transcend their body. I think that they do. They not only do through language, but now they do through communication technologies. It's more than the brain. The brain is the necessary but not sufficient condition for understanding what it means to be human in today's modern world. Thanks.